In astrology, dignity is one of the simplest and most important techniques that there is. It's so fundamental, it's so foundational, it's so essential. But sadly, it's also one of the most misunderstood and poorly applied techniques around, which leads to many practitioners just kind of throwing it out the window and thinking that it's not very useful. So let's take some time now to really better understand how great this technique is for interpreting planets in their signs. So what is dignity? Well, in Latin, the word means worthiness or respectability. And according to Oxford Dictionary, it means the same thing in English. It means behavior that is worthy of respect. So in other words, when a person is dignified, it means their actions and their behavior are respectable or honorable. And on the converse, if you're undignified or if you have indignity, then your behavior is unbecoming, let's say. It's not honorable, it's disrespectful behavior. So this is exactly what astrological dignity deals with, except instead of my behavior or your behavior, it's talking about the behavior of the planets symbolically. So for example, let's take Mars. In this video, let's use Mars as our example planet. So treat Mars like a person, symbolically speaking, who's going to have some behavior, and that behavior is what you interpret in a chart. The behavior of Mars can either be dignified or undignified. If it's dignified, it means that Mars's behavior is respectable. And if it's undignified, it means it's not respectable, it's disrespectful. So what does that exactly mean for a planet like Mars? Well, a dignified Mars, for example, is very brave. Bravery is something that's very respectable and honorable, right? It's chivalrous, it's brave, it's heroic. Whereas the undignified Mars is very rash. It's very risky. What we're really dealing with here is one property of Mars, not two. Mars has the property of, let's call it, boldness. Boldness can either be expressed in a dignified manner or in an undignified manner, in a respectable way or in an unrespectable way. When boldness is very respectable, you get heroic behavior, you get confidence, you get bravery. But if that same boldness is expressed in a disrespectable manner, then you get somebody who's foolish, foolhardy, rash, risky. So you see how useful the dignity is to understanding the various possible interpretations of a planet. Mars, for example, if it's dignified, it has great strength, power. But if it's undignified, it's extremely dangerous. It lashes out, it gets explosively angry, it can be violent. So again, there's only one symbolism here about Mars, it's just that it's very powerful. And if that powerfulness is dignified, then it means strength. But if that strength is undignified, then it's just going to be rash and dangerous and risky unnecessarily. So now I think it's probably clearer what I'm talking about, how amazing this technique is, how useful it is, how fundamental it is. So let's go forward and talk about how you define dignity in astrology. How would you measure a planet's dignity? So if you look into this, you'll find that there's at least several different concepts of it. And what I'm going to share with you is the Vedic or Indic presentation of how dignity is measured. Why? Because the Indic tradition is extremely preservatory. It preserves things extremely well. And in Asia, the astrological culture wasn't decimated by other cultures. So you have a well-preserved and unbroken tradition in Indian astrology, which allows you to really get a clear picture of what the classical technique actually was. Once you understand dignity from the Indic point of view, the other points of view about it will all fall into place like little pieces of a jigsaw. And one more little disclaimer I want to make before we start. This technique is very, very simple, relatively speaking. But it gains sophistication and complexity by the fact that it needs to be applied recursively. Now, I'll explain what that recursive application means after we understand what the technique is in the first place. But I just want you to realize that if you're supposed to have a very dignified Mars for a person who's very violent, it doesn't mean that you throw away the technique and say it's junk. It's because you haven't applied the dignity technique recursively yet to figure out what the actual dignity of Mars is, not just on a face value. Simply by looking at the zodiac sign that a planet is in, that you know the actual dignity a planet has. Now, with that said, let's dive in and understand what this dignity thing is all about. Dignity is going to be measured on a scale or a spectrum between two extremes, high dignity and low dignity. The high dignity is called exalted, and the low dignity is called fallen. The state of having an exalted dignity means that you will be enhanced by facing your challenges. You exalt or you rise above things. And the state of having a fallen dignity means that you will be diminished or put down further by trying to face your challenges. When you are exalted in your dignity and a challenge comes to you, you give a dignified response to it. You give a respectable response to it, an honorable response, which actually causes you to triumph over the challenge and to increase your respectability and your prosperity. So we can say that a high or exalted dignity is in fact a dignified response from the planet. And conversely, low dignities, the fall condition, when the challenge comes, your spontaneous reaction is undignified. And hence you wind up shooting yourself in the foot. So let's call in Mars again to give this some more concreteness, give it more of a face. We said that Mars has these two extremes of what it represents. We picked out bravery and strength as dignified versions of Mars, and rashness and dangerousness as the undignified version. So an exalted Mars would be expressing this bravery and strength, and a fallen Mars would be expressing the rashness and the dangerousness that's possible from this planet. Those are the two extremes on the spectrum of dignity. Now there's other way stations in between these two extremes, marking out different points on the spectrum. First of all, we have a condition called domicile, or ownness, when the planet is in its own sign, a sign that it owns. The situation here is that this planet, symbolically speaking, doesn't face any challenges. It's unchallengeable. So you're still going to get the same dignified response from a planet in this condition as you would if they were exalted. So in other words, a Mars that's exalted or Mars that's in one of its own signs is symbolizing bravery, heroism, strength, efficacy. There's no real difference between the two conditions of dignity in that sense. But the difference is what spurs on the symbolism of the planet. An exalted Mars is expressing bravery and strength in an active way, whereas the domicile Mars is expressing it in a passive way. In other words, the Mars in its own sign doesn't face challenges because it passively has these dignified qualities of strength, heroism, bravery, etc. Therefore, challenges shy away from it. Challengers shy away. So that's slightly different than the exalted Mars, in which challenges are coming, or Mars is actually going out and seeking challenges and overcoming them. So in these two states of positive dignity, it's really basically the same interpretation, except that one is more active in expressing the positive traits. Now, how do we determine the other positions on this spectrum? Those positions are determined by how a guest feels about its host. So let's say Mars is in Leo, for example. That means that Mars is the guest and the owner of Leo, Sun, is the host. How does Mars feel about its host? That describes its dignity in those situations where it's not exalted or in its own sign or fallen. So we give planets the same kind of human polarity of either being friendly or unfriendly. So we'll call it being a friend or an enemy. If a planet's host or dispositor is its friend, then it has a good dignity. It feels assisted by the host. But if a planet's host is an enemy, then it has a low dignity because it feels thwarted by its host. Now, these two polarities of friendship and enemy are extended. Sometimes it can be a best friend not just an ordinary friend. And sometimes it can be a bitter enemy, not just an ordinary enemy. But it's the same basic idea, just more amplified. If a planet is in the sign of its best friend, then it's very strongly assisted. And if a planet is in the sign of its bitter enemy, then it's very strongly thwarted by that host. So the important thing to realize now, interpretively speaking, is that all four of these upper conditions give you basically the same interpretation. You get a positive or a dignified interpretation. Whereas the lower dignities on this spectrum all also give you basically the same interpretation, the undignified interpretation. You just have a difference, again, in why or how the dignified or undignified qualities are coming out. As we said, if you're exalted, then your dignified qualities are coming along with a sense of like chasing the conquering or the overcoming of problems. Actively being excited about overcoming things and rising above things. Whereas if you're in your own sign, it's more passive. You have these qualities inherently, so the challenges don't even arise in the first place. Now, with the friends, the two conditions of friendship, Mars, for example, in these two conditions of friendship, still represents heroism, bravery, etc., strength, effectiveness, etc. But it has a little bit of a sense of having some undignified trait to it that its friends or its guides or its mentors help it out of. So, for example, if you have Mars in a friend's sign, then the native has some instinct to be rash or dangerous or risky or angry or violent. They have some inclination to that. But because of their good partners, because of their good guides, mentors, role models, etc., they get corrected or they feel inspired away from that negative behavior, the negative version of Mars, before it becomes any sort of a problem. And you apply the same exact technique to understanding the three different types of negative dignity interpretations. If it's a fall condition, then the negative traits of the planet are coming out like actively. The native is actually trying to overcome their problems by these foolish responses. Like for Mars, the person will go out to try to face their challenge with their unpreparedness and riskiness and rashness and anger. Whereas the other two conditions of low dignity, the inimical conditions, the conditions that arise from being in an enemy sign, Mars has some knowledge that it shouldn't behave that way. It would try not to be undignified. This native would try to be brave instead of rash. They would try to be strong and effective instead of angry. But because of their bad partners or their bad role models, or their negative conditions in their life, it makes it very difficult or almost impossible for them to be that way completely. So they wind up falling into the undignified traits of Mars, even though they know they shouldn't. Now you understand the fundamental spectrum of dignity and how to use it in interpretations, I hope. I want to make many more videos going into the details of these things, but I first want to check and see if this video gets a lot of likes, a lot of views, if people care about it, a lot of comments asking for these things. If we do get that sort of response, then I'll make these other videos that I'm planning on. First of all, I want to make a video on how do you find the special dignity signs? How do you know where Mars is exalted, where it's fallen? How do you know which signs Mars owns? And why are those signs the exaltation and the ownership signs, etc.? A second video that I want to make, if you guys are excited about it, is planetary friendships. What are the friendships and enmities between the planets? And how do you figure out that part of the dignity? The third thing that I think is also very important to do would be the concept that I mentioned of dignity needing to be recursive. What does it even mean and how is it applied recursively? So please, if you like those three concepts, let me know in the comments, let me know with a like, a subscribe, watch the video a billion times and so forth, so I get the picture that this is something that you guys want to see. If you want to know your dignities for your planets and a whole lot more, then go to my website, victorcarrot.com, and order the complete overview of your birth chart. That's going to give you that information and a lot more great stuff. Thank you so much.